there, thanks for checking out this R&R Ask the Expert. Today I am very excited to be joined by Burton, and we are here to talk about the latest edition of the S500. This is the 5th revision. Brandon is the standards chair for the IICRC Standards Committee. He's also part of the IICRC, RIA, and AIHA Crisis Response Task Force. And somehow he is also the VP of Technical Application for Next Year Solutions. So, Brandon, thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to toss it right over to you. And I want to start with the basics on this for people who are newer in the industry. Can you explain a little bit about what the S500 is and why it is so important to restoration contractors?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you, Michelle, for having me on today. I think this is probably one of the more important developments that we're seeing outside of everything that's going on with COVID and some of the other stuff we've been dealing with. But it's a really big deal for the industry to see an update in the S500 because it is a very important document for our industry. I think most will know or be familiar with the S500, but what you may not know is that the S500 really is kind of the leading standard for the IICRC. The IICRC has somewhere in the neighborhood of approximately 13 or 14 standards currently published and a number that are in development that we can probably touch on later. But the S500 really set a precedent because most of our standards that we see in industry are important to the individual using the standard, but the S500 is the one standard out there that's not only important to the restorer, it's also important to the insurance community and third-party administrators, and it creates that common ground for all of these interests to come together and really play from the same sheet of music. And it's successfully done that for over a decade. So it's been a wonderful breath of fresh air for our industry.
Okay, all right. So this is the 5th edition of the standard. So what goes into revising a standard like this? How long did this round of revisions take? How many people were involved? Tell us the details.
So this process actually began in January of 2018. That's how long this took. And it wasn't intended to take this long, although it never is in standards. It's never intended to take as long as it does. But the reason it does is because it is a massive amount of work. That work was completed by about 11 consensus body members, in addition to the staff from the IICRC that support that process. And just a quick shout out to the chair of the S500 standard, Chris Taylor, who really coordinated that consensus body, and to Millie Washington, the standards director, and Cheryl Smith, the standards coordinator. They all led that process through that 3-year revision cycle. It's a lot of work because you begin the process by really considering first what needs to be updated, what's changed in industry, so new regulatory information, et cetera, that needs to be considered. So then the consensus body then goes through that work, and then you go through a peer review cycle, or a public review cycle, I guess would be a better way to describe it in this case, where you get a number of comments that come in from different experts in the industry about what has changed, what hasn't changed, what changes they were expecting and didn't see, or what changes they don't understand. And all of that is governed by the ANSI process, so that we ensure that we have balanced consideration on all of it. And that's what really creates the lion's share of the work, is just making sure it's not a document written by those 11 people. It's a document that is adopted by industry at large, and ensuring that balance is represented.
Okay, all right. So what are some of the biggest revisions from this time around?
So there were updates throughout the document, but if I wanted to start just at 30,000 feet and kind of work our way down from there, the reference guide was removed. That's probably the biggest structural change. So it was the standard and reference guide. It's now the S500 standard only. So we removed the reference guide from the document. That led to a process of ensuring that all of the really critical information that was in the reference guide got moved over into the standard. So the standard section itself got a little bit longer. There's a little more explanatory language in the standard itself, in line with the the required trigger words like what you should do or what you shall do. But if I want to get a little bit more specific, I would categorize most of the changes as clarifications. So clarifications on things like the definition of Category 3 water, a couple of additions made there about what is that grossly unsanitary condition, and how do we consider something like a trap, and how does that affect that in a plumbing system. We also saw clarifications around drying goals, and this is, to me, is probably one of the ones that's closer to my heart, because the monitoring side of water is where I spent most of my career. So So good clarifications on what is a drying goal, how is it achieved. But from there, you could really expand out, and there were also clarifications around required documentation, air filtration devices, the role of the third-party expert in the process. So really a lot of changes throughout, and again, categorizing them mostly as clarifications.
Okay, all right. So admittedly, digesting the S500 solo can be a bit of an undertaking for any contractor or technician, but it's also really important to understand for many reasons. So what recommendations do you have for anybody watching this as far as learning the S500, going through training, understanding the ins and outs, and then being able to put them into practice?
The biggest thing, unfortunately, is just to read it, right? That's the biggest. And I know it's a daunting task, but a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel there. It's just the standard. It's not the standard and the reference guides. There's not as much material for you to digest, at least. Although I'll give you some suggestions, the biggest one is going to be reading it, because nothing will replace reading and understanding the document. But having said that, I do have two suggestions that I'll make. Number one, the IICRC is running a webinar on May 27th. So it'd be a really good idea to make sure you're registered for that, because you'll have a chance to listen directly to the consensus body and the individuals that comprise that body, who will represent different sections of the document and really highlight some of the more substantive changes. The other suggestion that I would make is that consensus body is made up of a number of our industry trainers. Our experts that are out there teaching, they're doing classes, they're teaching WRT classes for technicians, they're teaching ASD classes for techs and project managers. So really seek out some of those consensus body members as you're looking at your training and your certification, if you really want to get some firsthand experience with what changed. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. And again, you can go to the IICRC's webinar May 27th and get a good feel for who those individuals are.
Perfect. Okay. So you touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but how can having a good working knowledge of the S500 not only help dry a structure, but also help things like getting paid?
So to me, that's one of the most important things behind the S500, actually, is that it is a tool for that. As I mentioned, I touched on it earlier. It is the common ground that many of the stakeholders in our industry come to understand what truly is the best practice. What is the right way to accomplish this myriad of tasks that we accomplish in a water damage project? So if we understand the standard, we follow the standard and cite the standard even in our documentation, it provides that common place for us to come to where it's not an opinion, right? This is the way that these things are supposed to be done. The missing element for a lot of contractors when they do this is not directly citing the standard where they run into challenges with a third party. If you can specifically state that this was done in accordance with section, XYZ of the ANSI IICRC S500, then typically that'll calm or calm a lot of the challenges that we run into. And I find personally with contractors that do that, and they do it religiously in their documentation, not only they become very good at it, they start to really memorize the standard, but they run into a far fewer number of challenges with their accounts receivable, because they do get paid a lot faster when they're citing the standard.
Okay, perfect. All right. And also looping back to the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned that there are some other standards out there that are maybe being created or going through revisions. So what is in the works right now in the IICRC?
So super excited about a couple of areas and standards specifically that I want to cite, although I'll mention generally that we have standards that are in revision or in development in virtually every subject that the IICRC touches. So the Institute of Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification, right? That's a lot of subject matter. And there are standards in all of those areas that are under development or are under revision. But two areas specifically that I want to mention, we have a 400 series of standards that deals specifically with cleaning and maintenance of the built environment. And in that series, there's a 400, the core series, the core document, that is dealing specifically with the cleaning and maintenance of that space. But then you also have the S410 under development, which deals more specifically with infection control. And given everything our world has been exposed to recently with COVID, it's wonderful timing to have a group of experts really focused on that topic and focused on that subject. They're doing wonderful work. So I would look for something available from that consensus body for public review sometime later this year. The other series that I'm really excited about is the 700 series. And the 700 series deals specifically with fire and smoke restoration. And there again, we have multiple standards that are in the process of development. You have the 700 core document, which is going to deal with structural restoration from a structure fire, so fire and smoke restoration. And to me, this has been the longest overdue standard for our industry. It's the second most common type of peril that we deal with as a restoration community. And although there's been great information and great documentation on it from the Restoration Industry Association in the past, there's never really been an ANSI standard available for it. So the RIA and the IICRC really came together and banded forces to begin development of this standard. And I want to anticipate that this one again will be in public review this year. And that consensus body is making great headway. And it's a great group of experts that are working on that document.
Awesome. Okay, so I have another question based on those experts. If there are people watching this who would like to get involved, there may be kind of seasoned restorers and want to get more involved in the industry, how do they go about that?
The most important thing that you need to have is a bookmark to IICRC.org. All right, so go to IICRC.org, click on the standards tab, and right underneath that standards tab, you're going to see the status of all documents that are looking for volunteers. You'll find open volunteer applications under those where we're looking for folks to actually participate in those consensus bodies or for public review. For those that are already in process for their revision, you'll see a status that they're in that revision process or in that revision cycle, which is a really good indicator that at some point soon they're going to be open for public review. So IICRC.org, click on the standards tab and stay up to date with where we need your help, where we need your support, and jump in and volunteer.
Perfect. Love it. Okay. This industry always needs more volunteers. I feel
Absolutely.
like, there are a lot of people who do volunteer, but, you also end up with kind of the same people a lot of times. And that's such a good way to get involved, a good way to meet other people and all that. So, okay. Anything else that we missed, Brandon? Anything you want to add to this conversation?
No, I thank you for the opportunity to shed a little bit of light on what's happening with standards right now. It's a really big year for standards with the IICRC because we do have so many new standards that are under development. So I'm super excited for where we're going to be here in another 5-6 months with standards. So pay attention. We've got lots coming.
Perfect. Thank you, Brandon, very much. And to those watching this, stay tuned for more updates from the IICRC. R&R does monthly updates, and so stay tuned. There will always be more. Brandon, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Michelle.